Pam Johnson clutched the eviction notice with trembling hands, 3 months behind on rent for the cramped apartment she shared with 12-year-old Michael and 8-year-old William. When her father Robert called with devastating news, an Alzheimer's diagnosis, her world tilted completely. Robert Johnson had driven city buses for 35 years, the strongest man she knew. Even after their mother Carmen died 5 years ago from cancer, he'd maintained the steady routine that anchored their family. Now, at 78, he faced a battle he couldn't win alone. At the modest Pilsen home where she'd grown up, Pam found her father looking smaller and more fragile. Her brother David was already there, successful, driving his BMW, living in Lincoln Park with wife Jennifer. He advocated for assisted living and professional care, dismissing Pam's capabilities. Pam worked as a minimum-wage home health aide since her divorce 3 years ago, when her ex-husband Carlos abandoned them for a younger woman in Phoenix. She could barely support herself and her kids, but watching her father's fear and David's detachment, she made a life-altering decision. Despite having no money and facing eviction, Pam chose to move in with Robert and become his full-time caregiver. David criticized the decision, calling it unrealistic and refusing future support. But Pam knew this was what family meant, choosing love over convenience, sacrifice over self-interest. 2 weeks later, she and her boys moved into the house on 18th Street. Pam gave up her already precarious financial stability to care for the man who had given her everything. While David returned to his comfortable life, Pam began 6 years of devotion that would cost her everything she thought she owned, but reveal everything she truly was. It was a choice that would define not just her father's final years, but the entire trajectory of their family's future. Pam and her boys had moved into the house on 18th Street. Michael took the small room that had been David's, while William bunked with Pam in her old bedroom. Robert insisted they take the master bedroom, but Pam refused. This was still his house, his sanctuary. The transition was harder than she'd anticipated. Robert's confusion came in waves. Some days he was completely himself, helping William with homework and sharing stories about the old neighborhood. Other days he'd forget Pam's name or become convinced that Carmen was just running late from work. Pam's work hours became erratic. She'd take early morning shifts so she could be home before Robert woke up disoriented, or evening shifts when Michael could watch both William and his grandfather. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, was understanding at first, but patience wore thin as Pam missed more and more hours. "Pam, I hate to do this, but I need reliability. You've missed 12 shifts this month." I know. It's just temporary while we figure out a routine. I'm going to have to cut your hours. Part-time only. And only when you can guarantee you'll show up. Part-time minimum wage wouldn't cover gas, let alone food and utilities. That night, as she sat at her father's kitchen table calculating impossible mathematics, bills versus income that would never balance, Robert shuffled in wearing his old CTA uniform shirt. "Dad, it's 2 in the morning." He looked around, confused. "I'm going to be late for work." "You retired, remember?" 5 years ago. No. I have to drive the number 12 route. People are depending on me." This was the hardest part. Not the physical care, but watching her strong, dependable father become lost in his own mind. Pam gently guided him back to bed, straightening his covers the way he used to do for her when she had nightmares. "Sweetheart," his voice was suddenly clear, present. "I know this is hard. I know you gave up everything. I didn't give up anything important. Your boys need stability. You need a future. We're fine, Dad. We're together." He reached into his nightstand drawer and pulled out a small key. "The desk in my room. Bottom drawer locked. There's money there, not much, but enough to help with groceries. Use it." "Dad, I can't." "You can and you will. Promise me." The next morning, Pam found $3,000 in 20s and 50s carefully wrapped in one of Carmen's old dish towels. It was more money than she'd seen at one time in years, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Months passed. Robert's condition deteriorated slowly but steadily. Pam learned to manage his medications, to redirect his confusion, to handle the incontinence and the wandering and the nights when he'd call out for Carmen, breaking Pam's heart over and over again. Michael stepped up in ways that no 12-year-old should have to, walking William to school, helping with dinner, doing homework at the kitchen table while Pam bathed their grandfather. William, sweet and adaptable, treated it all like an adventure, chattering to Robert about his day whether the old man understood or not. David visited occasionally, usually with his wife Jennifer, a thin blonde woman who spoke to Robert slowly and loudly, as if he were deaf rather than confused. They'd stay for an hour, uncomfortable with the realities of caregiving, then leave with promises to help out more that never materialized. Pam's sister Eleanor was worse. 2 years younger than David, she lived in the suburbs with her husband Mark and their twin daughters. Eleanor had inherited their mother's beauty and their father's stubbornness, but none of their compassion. She worked as a paralegal and considered herself the family intellectual. "This is exactly what I expected," Elena said during one of her rare visits, wrinkling her nose at the smell of Robert's lunch, which he'd dropped on his shirt. "You've turned this place into a nursing home." "I've turned it into a place where Dad can live with dignity." "Look at yourself, Pam. When's the last time you had a haircut or went on a date? You're 35 years old, not 55. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're existing, not living. And what kind of example are you setting for your boys?" Pam bit back a dozen sharp responses. Elena visited maybe once a month, usually staying just long enough to criticize before retreating to her perfect suburban life. She had no idea what it was like to wake up 3 times a night to check on Robert, to clean up accidents, to see him slip away a little more each day. But there were good moments too. Evenings when Robert's mind was clear and he'd tell stories about the old days, about meeting Carmen at a church dance, about the night each of his children was born. William would curl up next to his grandfather while Robert pointed out constellations through the kitchen window, the same ones he'd shown Pam when she was small. "You see those 3 stars in a line? That's Orion's belt, the warrior who was so handsome that the goddess fell in love with him." "What happened to him, abuelo?" "He was placed in the stars so he could watch over people like you and Michael and your mama." Those moments made everything worthwhile. The exhaustion, the financial strain, the way her own life had contracted to the boundaries of this house and Robert's needs. Pam had never been religious like her mother, but caring for her father felt like a sacred duty, a way of honoring everything he'd given her. It was during one of these peaceful evenings, 6 years after she'd first moved in, that everything changed. Robert had been having more bad days than good ones, and Pam had finally arranged for a part-time aide to help during the day so she could work more hours. Mrs. Wilson was patient and kind, and Robert seemed to like her, which was rare these days. Pam was reviewing bills at the kitchen table when David called. "Dad's getting worse, isn't he?" Yes. There was no point in sugarcoating it anymore. "Eleanor and I have been talking. We think it's time to consider other options." "What kind of options?" "There's a memory care facility in Schaumburg. Very nice specialized staff. We went and looked at it last weekend." Pam's blood went cold. "You what?" "We're trying to be proactive here, Pam. Dad needs professional care now, and frankly, you look exhausted. This isn't sustainable." "Dad stays here. That's not negotiable." "It's not just your decision anymore. Elena and I are his children too, and we think this is what's best." "Where were you for the past 6 years when I was making all the other decisions? When I was giving him his medications at 3 in the morning and cleaning up his accidents and holding his hand through panic attacks? That was your choice, Pam. No one forced you." The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. "Get out." "What?" "If you're going to put him in a facility, you'll have to go through me first. And I won't make it easy." She hung up and immediately called Robert's doctor, Dr. Martinez, who had been seeing him for 3 years. "Pam, your father specifically named you as his healthcare proxy and power of attorney. Your siblings can't override that decision." Relief flooded through her. Robert had insisted on the paperwork 2 years ago, during one of his lucid periods. "I want Pam to make the decisions," he'd said. "She's the one who's been here." But the call had shaken her. David and Eleanor were circling now, and she had a terrible feeling that this was just the beginning. 3 months later, on a rainy Tuesday in December, Robert Johnson died peacefully in his sleep. Pam found him in the morning, looking more at rest than he had in months. She held his still warm hand and whispered all the things she should have said more often. How proud she was to be his daughter, how grateful she was for everything he'd taught her, how much she'd miss him. The funeral was small but dignified. Robert's old co-workers from the CTA came, along with neighbours who remembered Carmen's kindness and Robert's steady presence in the community. David gave a eulogy about their father's work ethic and dedication to family, words that felt hollow coming from someone who'd visited maybe a dozen times in 6 years. Elena cried dramatically, leaning on her husband Mark for support, as if she'd been the primary caregiver rather than the critic who'd shown up once a month to point out everything Pam was doing wrong. After the service, as Pam stood beside the grave where Robert would rest next to Carmen, David approached her. "We need to talk about the house." "Not today, David." "When then?" "Elena and I have been patient, but Dad's gone now. We need to settle his estate." Pam looked at her brother, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. When had he become this person? When had money become more important than memory, property more valuable than the years she'd spent caring for their father? "The will reading is next week," Elena said, appearing at David's side. "Dad's lawyer called. We'll settle everything then." "Fine." Pam was too tired to fight, too hollowed out by grief to argue. She'd spent 6 years pouring everything she had into caring for Robert Johnson. Now she just wanted to rest. But as she watched her siblings walk away, already deep in conversation about property values and inheritance, Pam had the sinking feeling that her fight was just beginning. The law office of Mitchell and Associates smelled like old leather and broken dreams. Pam sat in one of 4 chairs arranged around a polished conference table, clutching her purse and trying to ignore the way Elena kept checking her watch and sighing dramatically. David drummed his fingers on the table, his impatience filling the room like static electricity. "Where is this guy?" Elena muttered. "I have to pick up the twins from dance class at 4. "It's barely 3, Pam said quietly. She'd arranged for Mrs. Wilson to watch Michael and William after school, using money she couldn't afford to spend. But this was important. This would determine whether her boys had a stable home or if they'd be back to apartment hunting with Pam's non-existent credit and minimum wage income. The door opened, and Theodore Mitchell entered. He was older than Pam had expected, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. He carried a thick manila folder and wore the expression of a man who'd seen families tear themselves apart over money more times than he cared to count. "I apologize for the delay. Thank you all for coming." He settled into his chair and opened the folder. "I've been your father's attorney for 15 years, and I want to start by saying that Robert Johnson was one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to know." Eleanor shifted impatiently. David nodded politely but kept glancing at his phone. "Your father was very specific about his wishes, and he updated his will several times over the years, particularly after your mother's death, and again after his diagnosis." Mr. Mitchell pulled out several documents. The bulk of his estate consists of the family home at 1247 West 18th Street, valued at approximately $200,000. Pam's heart hammered against her ribs. 200,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was stability for her boys, a place they could call home without fear of eviction notices. There are also some savings accounts, totaling about $15,000, and his pension benefits, which will continue to his named beneficiary. David leaned forward. "So we're looking at roughly $215 split 3 ways?" "Not exactly." Mr. Mitchell's voice was carefully neutral. Your father left specific instructions. The house and the majority of the liquid assets go to Pam Johnson in recognition of the care she provided during his illness. The words hit Pam like a physical force. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears threatening to spill over. What? Elena's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. That's not possible. He wouldn't have. There must be some mistake, David said, his face flushing red. Our father wouldn't have left everything to one child. That's not the kind of man he was. Mr. Mitchell pulled out a document and slid it across the table. This is your father's will, signed and witnessed 18 months ago. He was very clear about his reasoning. I quote, "To my daughter Pam, who sacrificed years of her life to care for me with love and dedication when I needed it most, I leave my home and the majority of my worldly possessions. She has earned this through her devotion, and I know she will use it wisely to care for her children as she cared for me." Pam couldn't breathe. 6 years of sleepless nights, of choosing between her father's medication and groceries, of watching her boys grow up too fast because they had to. It had all led to this moment. "This is bullshit," Elena snapped, her professional composure cracking. Pam manipulated him. Dad had Alzheimer's. He wasn't competent to make these kinds of decisions. Your father was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, but his mental competency was evaluated by doctor. Martinez before each will update. The documentation is thorough. Mr. Mitchell's tone remained steady. However, David and Elena, you are not forgotten. Your father left you each $5,000 and several personal items. $5,000. Pam could see the calculation in her sibling's eyes. 5,000 versus a house worth 200,000. The math of betrayal was simple. We want to contest this, David said immediately. Obviously, Pam used her position to influence our father's decisions. She isolated him from the rest of the family and manipulated a sick old man. That's not true, Pam whispered, but her voice was lost in Elena's sharp agreement. Absolutely, we're contesting this. Pam moved in like a vulture, pushed the rest of us out, and brainwashed Dad into thinking we didn't care. This will is the product of elder abuse. Elder abuse. The words hit Pam like a slap. She thought of all the nights she'd held Robert's hand during panic attacks, all the times she'd patiently redirected his confusion instead of getting frustrated, all the moments when she'd chosen his dignity over her own convenience. That is a serious allegation, Mr. Mitchell said carefully. Do you have any evidence of abuse or undue influence? She controlled his money, Elena said. She isolated him from family. She was the only one with access to him during his final years. Because she was the only one who showed up, Pam finally found her voice. Where were you when he fell and broke his wrist? Where were you when he had pneumonia and spent 4 days in the hospital? Where were you every single day for 6 years? We had our own lives, David shot back. We couldn't just drop everything like you did. I didn't drop everything. I gave up everything. There's a difference. Ladies, gentlemen, Mr. Mitchell interrupted. These are emotional times. I understand everyone is grieving and tensions are high. But the will is legally sound. If you choose to contest it, that's your right. But I should warn you, will contests are expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful when the documentation is as thorough as your father's. David and Eleanor exchanged a look. Pam recognized that look from childhood. It was the same expression they'd worn when plotting to get out of chores or blame Pam for something they'd done. We'll be in touch, Eleanor said coldly, standing to leave. After her siblings left, mister. Mitchell gathered his papers slowly. Pam, I want you to know that your father spoke about you often. He was very proud of the woman you'd become and very grateful for your sacrifice. I didn't feel like a sacrifice. He was my father. That's exactly what he said you'd say. The old lawyer smiled sadly. He also said to tell you that he was sorry for the burden this inheritance might become. But he knew you were strong enough to handle whatever came next. Pam drove home in a daze, Robert's house keys heavy in her palm. Her house keys now. She pulled into the driveway of 1247 West 18th Street and sat in the car, looking at the modest home that had sheltered 3 generations of Johnson children. The blue siding needed painting, and the front steps sagged a little, but it was solid. It was theirs. "Mom," Michael appeared at the car window, backpack slung over his shoulder. "How did it go?" "Good. Really good." She got out and hugged him tight. "We get to stay." Forever? Forever. For 2 weeks, Pam allowed herself to believe it might be that simple. She started making plans. William could stay at his school, Michael could try out for that travel soccer team, maybe she could even take some classes and get certified as a licensed practical nurse. The future stretched out ahead of them, bright with possibility. Then the process server knocked on her door. "Pam Johnson." "Yes." "You've been served." The legal documents were thick and full of words like undue influence and diminished capacity and fraudulent conveyance. David and Eleanor were contesting the will, claiming that Pam had manipulated their father and isolated him from his family. They wanted the house sold and the proceeds split equally among the 3 siblings. Pam called Mr. Mitchell immediately. "I'm afraid this is exactly what I expected," he said. "Your siblings have hired Brennan and Associates. They're aggressive litigators who specialize in estate disputes." "What does that mean for me?" "It means this is going to be expensive and unpleasant. They'll try to paint you as manipulative and greedy. They'll dig into your finances, your personal life, anything they can use to build their case." "But the will is valid, right?" Dad was competent when he signed it. "Yes, but will contests don't always come down to facts. Sometimes they come down to who tells a more compelling story." The legal bills started immediately. Pam had to hire her own attorney, which meant taking out loans she couldn't afford. Every day brought new paperwork, new depositions, new ways for David and Eleanor's lawyers to make her feel like a criminal for loving her father. They interviewed Mrs. Wilson, who testified that Robert had been well cared for and that Pam had been devoted to his well-being. They interviewed Dr. Martinez, who confirmed that Robert had been competent to make legal decisions. They even interviewed Michael and William, which made Pam furious. Her children shouldn't have to defend their mother's love for their grandfather. But David and Elena's lawyers were good at what they did. They found neighbors who testified that they'd rarely seen Robert outside the house in his final years, supporting the narrative that Pam had isolated him. They questioned the timing of the will updates, suggesting that Pam had pressured Robert when his judgment was compromised. Most damaging of all, they brought up Pam's financial situation. "Isn't it true, Miss R. Johnson, that you were facing eviction when you moved in with your father?" "Yes, but..." "And isn't it true that you had access to your father's bank accounts?" "He gave me permission to use his money for household expenses." "How convenient." "And how much of your father's money did you spend during your 6 years of caring for him?" Pam's lawyer had prepared her for this, but it still felt like being flayed alive. Yes, she'd used Robert's money for groceries, utilities, medical supplies. Yes, she'd occasionally bought clothes for the boys or paid for Michael's school pictures. Every purchase had felt necessary at the time, but under the harsh lights of a deposition room, it all sounded calculating and selfish. The process dragged on for 8 months. 8 months of legal fees eating away at Pam's savings, of sleepless nights wondering if she'd lose the only home her boys had ever known, of watching David and Eleanor grow colder and more distant as the battle intensified. Finally, exhausted and nearly broke, Pam's lawyer delivered the devastating news. "They're offering a settlement. The house gets sold and the proceeds split 3 ways, minus legal fees. You'd walk away with about $40,000. And if we don't settle, we go to trial, which could drag on for another year and cost another $30,000 in legal fees. Even if we win, you'd be lucky to break even." Pam sat in her lawyer's office, staring at papers that would sign away her father's house, and felt something break inside her chest. After everything, 6 years of sacrifice, 8 months of legal hell, she was going to lose. "I need to think about it." That night, she sat at Robert's kitchen table, the same table where she'd helped him with his medications and shared quiet conversations about the past. Michael was at basketball practice, and William was upstairs doing homework, unaware that their world was about to collapse again. The phone rang. Elena's number. Pam? I wanted to talk to you before you make your decision about the settlement. What's to talk about? You're getting what you wanted. This isn't personal. This is about fairness. Dad left everything to you, and that wasn't fair to David and me. Fair? Pam laughed, but there was no humour in it. You want to talk about fair? Where were you when Dad fell down the stairs because he was confused and scared? Where were you when he cried because he couldn't remember Mom's name? Where were you when he needed help going to the bathroom or when he wandered outside in his pyjamas at 2 in the morning? We had our own responsibilities. I had responsibilities too. I had 2 kids to raise and bills to pay and a life that I put on hold for 6 years. But Dad was more important than any of that. Look, I know you made sacrifices, but that doesn't mean you should inherit everything. David and I loved Dad too. Did you? Because love looks like showing up, Elena. Love looks like choosing someone else's needs over your own convenience. Love looks like being there on the bad days, not just the good ones. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. The settlement offer expires tomorrow. If you don't sign it, we're going to trial, and our lawyers think we can get the will thrown out entirely. You could end up with nothing. After Eleanor hung up, Pam sat in the darkness of her father's kitchen and cried. She cried for Robert, who'd worked so hard his entire life, only to have his children fight over the scraps he'd left behind. She cried for her boys, who were about to lose their stability again. And she cried for herself, for the naive belief that doing the right thing would somehow be rewarded. The next morning she signed the settlement papers. The house sold quickly for $195,000. After legal fees and realtor commissions, each sibling received about $55,000. It was more than the original settlement offer, but it felt like nothing compared to what Pam had lost. David and Elena were practically giddy at the closing. They made plans for their windfall. David wanted to buy a boat. Elena was thinking about a kitchen renovation. They acted as if they'd won the lottery instead of destroying their family. See? Elena said to Pam as they left the lawyer's office. This worked out for everyone. You got a nice chunk of money, and now you can make a fresh start. A fresh start. As if 6 years of her life could be reduced to a financial transaction. As if the love she'd poured into caring for Robert could be quantified and divided equally among his children. That afternoon, Pam found herself standing in front of the house one last time. The new owners would take possession next week. She walked through the rooms where she'd lived with her father and sons, remembering the good moments and the hard ones, the laughter and the tears, the ordinary Tuesday evenings that had felt like the most important work of her life. In Robert's bedroom, she found a small wooden box she'd somehow missed during the packing. Inside was a photo of Robert and Carmen on their wedding day, young and hopeful and deeply in love. Underneath the photo was a folded piece of paper covered in Robert's handwriting, shaky but still recognizable. For my Pam, it read, you gave me the gift of dying at home, surrounded by love instead of strangers. You gave me dignity when this disease tried to take it away. You are the daughter every father dreams of having, and I am prouder of you than words can say. Take care of your boys and remember that love is the only inheritance that really matters. Your loving father, Robert. Pam pressed the letter to her chest and sobbed. For everything she'd lost, and everything she'd gained, for the father who'd seen her sacrifice and the siblings who'd chosen money over memory. But mostly she cried because she knew Robert had been right. Love was the only inheritance that really mattered, and she was richer in that currency than David or Eleanor would ever understand. 2 weeks later, Pam and her boys moved into a rented trailer in a mobile home park, 20 miles from their old neighborhood. It was small and cramped and nothing like the house on 18th Street, but it was theirs for now. She used some of the settlement money to buy a reliable car and put the rest in savings for the boys' college fund. Michael hated the new school and missed his friends. William adapted better, making new friends with the resilience of childhood. Pam took on extra shifts at work, trying to rebuild their life one paycheck at a time. But late at night, when the trailer was quiet and her boys were asleep, Pam would hold Robert's letter and remember what it felt like to be valued, to be chosen, to matter more than money. Her siblings had won the battle, but they'd lost something precious in the process. They'd lost the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally, that their worth wasn't measured in dollars and cents. It would take time, but Pam was going to be okay. She had her boys, she had her memories of Robert's grateful smile, and she had the unshakable certainty that she'd done the right thing, even when it cost her everything. David and Elena had their money, but Pam had kept her soul, and in the end that was worth far more than they'd ever understand. 6 months after losing her father's house, Pam Johnson was living paycheck to paycheck in the cramped trailer, working double shifts as a home health aide just to keep the lights on. The $55,000 from the settlement had dwindled faster than she'd expected, paying off legal debts, securing the rental, buying a decent used car, and covering the boys' needs as they adjusted to their new life. What remained sat in a savings account, untouched, waiting for a real emergency. The February morning when everything changed started like any other. Pam was getting ready for her early shift, trying to be quiet so she wouldn't wake Michael and William in the trailer's thin-walled bedrooms. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson. "Can you cover Janet's afternoon shift?" She called in sick. Another 12-hour day. Pam's body ached just thinking about it, but they needed the money. She was typing back her agreement when someone knocked on the trailer door. She peered through the small window and froze. Theodore Mitchell stood on her narrow front steps, looking oddly formal in his expensive overcoat among the mobile homes and chain-link fences. "Mr. Mitchell?" She opened the door, suddenly conscious of her work scrubs and the trailer's cramped interior visible behind her. "What are you doing here?" "May I come in, Pam?" "There's something important we need to discuss." Her heart hammered as she let him inside. Had David and Eleanor found another way to come after her? Some legal loophole that would take away what little she had left? "Would you like some coffee?" Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Always be polite to guests, even when you're worried about what they want." "That would be nice, thank you." As Pam busied herself with the small coffee maker, Mr. Mitchell looked around the trailer with careful neutrality. She could only imagine what he thought: the mismatched furniture, the boys' schoolwork taped to the thin walls, the general air of making do with less. "How are Michael and William adjusting?" he asked. "They're resilient. Kids always are." Pam handed him a mug, settling across from him at the small dinette table. "Mr. Mitchell, why are you here? If David and Elena are trying something else..." "This has nothing to do with your siblings." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, different from the one she remembered from the will reading. "This is about something your father left specifically for you." "I don't understand." Everything was settled months ago. Mr. Mitchell opened the folder carefully. "Your father was a very private man, Pam. He came to see me about 6 months before he died, during one of his good periods. He was quite lucid and very specific about what he wanted to do." He pulled out a document and slid it across the table. Pam recognized her father's signature at the bottom, but the rest was legal language she couldn't pass. "Your father established a separate trust," Mr. Mitchell explained, "something completely apart from his will. He funded it over many years, starting long before his diagnosis. He was very clear that this trust was to remain confidential until after the will contest was resolved, one way or another." "A trust? What kind of trust?" "The kind that holds investments, Pam. Your father was much more sophisticated financially than anyone realized." Pam stared at him, not comprehending. "Investments? My father drove a bus. My mother worked at the post office. They weren't the kind of people who had investments." That's exactly what your father wanted everyone to think. Mr. Mitchell pulled out another document, this one covered in numbers and company names. Robert Johnson was incredibly disciplined about money. He and Carmen lived modestly, saved aggressively, and invested wisely. But they kept it absolutely secret. The numbers on the page swam before Pam's eyes. She saw stock symbols, dividend payments, account balances that didn't make sense. "I don't understand these numbers," Pam whispered, her finger tracing down the columns of figures. Mr. Mitchell leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Your father started investing when you were just a baby. $5 here, $10 there, whatever he could spare from his bus driver's salary. Your mother clipped coupons and bought generic brands so they could put away $20 or $30 a month. It doesn't sound like much, but over 35 years with compound interest and smart reinvestment." He pulled out a calculator and pointed to a figure at the bottom of the page. "The trust is currently valued at $2.3 million. The words hit Pam like a physical blow. She actually gasped, her coffee mug slipping from nerveless fingers and clattering against the table. That's not possible. Your father was particularly good at spotting undervalued companies. He bought Microsoft in 1986, Apple in 1997 when everyone thought it was finished, Amazon when it was just selling books. He held on to everything, reinvested the dividends, and never touched a penny." Pam's mind reeled. $2.3 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. Why didn't he tell me? All those years when I was struggling, when we could barely afford groceries. Because he knew that if his children learned about the money, they might not take care of him out of love. They might do it for inheritance. He wanted to know who would sacrifice for him without expecting anything in return. The cruelty of it took her breath away, even as she understood the wisdom. Robert had tested all 3 of his children, and only Pam had passed. He also knew, Mr. Mitchell continued, that David and Eleanor would have fought even harder for the house if they'd suspected there was more money involved. By keeping the trust secret, he protected both you and his true legacy. But why now? Why wait so long to tell me? Your father's instructions were very specific. I was to wait until the will contest was completely resolved, until you'd proven you could handle adversity with grace. He said, and I quote, "If Pam can lose everything and still not become bitter, then she's ready to have everything back." Pam laughed, but it came out cracked and strange. "Ready? Mr. Mitchell, I'm barely holding on. I'm working double shifts just to keep my boys fed. How is that being ready for anything?" "Your father didn't measure readiness by your bank account, Pam. He measured it by your character. You lost the house, but you didn't lose your dignity. You could have fought dirty like your siblings did, but you chose to take the high road even when it cost you everything." The trailer suddenly felt impossibly small. Pam stood up and paced to the window, looking out at the modest mobile home park, where her neighbours were getting ready for work, struggling with their own versions of making ends meet. "This doesn't feel real. I understand it's overwhelming, but there's more you need to know." Mr. Mitchell pulled out another document. "Your father also left detailed instructions about how he wanted the money used. This isn't just a windfall, Pam, it's a responsibility." She turned back to face him. "What kind of responsibility?" "He wanted you to use some of it to set up college funds for Michael and William. Full rides to whatever schools they can get into. He also wanted you to buy a house. Not just any house, but one where you can take in other families who are struggling the way you struggled." "Take in families?" "Your father envisioned something like a boarding house, but for single mothers and their children who need a place to rebuild their lives. He saw how you flourished when you had stable housing, and he wanted you to provide that stability for others." The scope of Robert's vision was staggering. He'd been planning this for decades, watching his quiet daughter grow into a woman who would sacrifice everything for family, and he'd been preparing to give her the tools to help others do the same. "There's one more thing." Mr. Mitchell reached into the folder again. Your father wrote you a letter. He gave it to me 3 years ago, with instructions that you should read it alone. The envelope was thick, Robert's careful handwriting spelling out for Pam, my heart, across the front. Pam's hands shook as she took it. I'll leave you to read this privately, Mr. Mitchell said, standing. When you're ready, call me. We have a lot of paperwork to complete, but there's no rush. The money has waited this long. It can wait a little longer. After he left, Pam sat alone in her trailer holding her father's final words. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Garcia next door getting her 3 children ready for school, the familiar chaos of single motherhood that Pam knew so well. Down the way, she could see Mr. Peterson heading to his early shift at the plant, already tired before his day began. These were her people now, the ones who worked hard and still struggled, who chose love over money because money was never really an option anyway. And somehow, Robert had known she'd find her way to them. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. My dearest Pam, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have survived the worst thing I ever did to you, letting your brother and sister take away your home. I pray you can forgive an old man for this necessary cruelty. I have been poor, honey, and I know that being poor makes you invisible to the world. People look through you, dismiss your struggles, assume you deserve whatever hardship you face. I never wanted that for my children, but I also never wanted my children to become the kind of people who look through others. You passed the test I never wanted to give you. You loved me when loving me cost you everything. You chose sacrifice over selfishness, dignity over desperation. You proved that the woman I raised, the daughter I am so proud of, has a heart that money cannot corrupt. But now I want you to have the money anyway, not as a reward. Love should never be transactional, but as a tool. You have learned what poverty teaches: compassion, resourcefulness, the knowledge that true wealth is measured in relationships, not bank accounts. Now you can use that wisdom to help others. Your mother and I were never wise enough to enjoy our money while we were alive. We were too afraid of losing it, too suspicious of our own good fortune. Don't make our mistakes, sweetheart. Buy nice things sometimes. Take your boys on vacations. Get your hair done and go on dates, and remember that you deserve happiness. But also remember the trailer park and the eviction notices and the nights when you fell asleep counting bills instead of blessings. Remember how it felt to be invisible, and use this money to help other invisible people become seen. I know you will do better with this inheritance than I ever did. You have already proven that you understand the only currency that truly matters: love given freely, without expectation of return. Your proud and loving father, Robert Johnson. P.S. Michael reminds me of myself at that age, all dreams and determination. William has your mother's gentle heart. They are going to be extraordinary men because they have you as their example. Tell them their abuelo knew they would make the world better, just like their mother does every day. Pam cried until she had no tears left, holding Robert's letter against her chest. Through the trailer's thin walls, she could hear life continuing around her, children getting ready for school, adults preparing for another day of hard work and small hopes. But now she saw it all differently. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning. Robert had given her more than money. He'd given her purpose. The knowledge that struggling wasn't failure, that working-class wisdom was its own kind of wealth, that the people society overlooked were often the ones most worth seeing. She looked around the trailer that had felt like a symbol of everything she'd lost, and suddenly saw it as preparation for everything she was about to gain. She understood now why Robert had made her wait, why she'd needed to lose the house and live paycheck to paycheck and learn what it meant to rebuild from nothing. You can't really help people until you've been where they are. You can't understand the weight of financial insecurity until you've carried it yourself. And you can't appreciate the true value of stability until you've lived without it. Pam wiped her eyes and reached for her phone. It was time to call Mr. Mitchell back. she had work to do. 3 weeks later, Pam stood in the driveway of a large Victorian house in Pilsen, just 6 blocks from where she'd grown up. The house needed work, new paint, updated plumbing, some structural repairs, but the bones were solid. It had 6 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and enough space downstairs for a large kitchen and common areas where families could gather. "It's perfect," she told the realtor, who was still visibly adjusting to Pam's transformation from mobile home resident to cash buyer with a $2.3 million portfolio. Michael and William raced through the empty rooms, their voices echoing off the hardwood floors. "Can I have the room with the window seat?" William called out. "We'll figure it out," Pam called back, but she was already mentally designing the space. Michael and William would each have their own rooms on the 3rd floor, private space where they could be teenagers without worrying about the families they'd be sharing the house with. The 2nd floor would be for their guests, women and children who needed a safe place to land while they got back on their feet. Pam was already working with social services to develop a program. Not charity exactly, but something more like what family should be. Support without judgment, help without strings attached. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Heard through the grapevine that you bought a house. Hope you're not overextending yourself with that settlement money." Pam smiled and deleted the message without responding. Let Elena and David think what they wanted. The truth would come out eventually, but Pam was in no hurry to share it. She'd learned the value of privacy from Robert, the wisdom of keeping your own counsel until you were ready to act. A month later, the renovations were complete and Pam's first family moved in. Rosa Hernandez and her 2 young daughters. Rosa had left an abusive husband with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a determination to build a better life. She worked nights cleaning office buildings and was saving money for nursing school. "I can't afford much rent," Rosa had said during their interview, her pride warring with desperation. "The rent is whatever you can afford," Pam had replied, "and when you're a nurse making good money, you can help the next family who needs this place." Rosa had cried then, the way Pam had cried when Robert's letter showed her that love could come back to you in ways you never expected. The house filled up quickly. There was Jennifer, a young widow with twin boys who was working 2 jobs to keep her family afloat after her husband died in a construction accident. There was Carmen, named after Pam's mother, a grandmother raising her daughter's children while her daughter fought addiction. There was Luce, who had aged out of foster care at 18 and was working toward her GED while caring for her infant son. Each woman brought her own story, her own struggles, her own fierce determination to create something better for her children. Pam provided stability, resources, and something even more valuable, the knowledge that someone believed in their ability to succeed. The house became exactly what Robert had envisioned, a place where invisible people became seen, where working-class wisdom was valued, where love was shared without expectation of return. Michael thrived in his new environment, helping the younger children with homework and becoming a big brother to a dozen kids who needed his steady presence. William, true to Carmen's gentle nature, seemed to instinctively know when someone needed comfort, appearing with quiet hugs and his infectious laugh. But the sweetest revenge came 6 months later, when Pam ran into David at the grocery store. She was loading groceries into her car, not the battered Honda anymore, but a reliable SUV with room for car seats and soccer equipment and all the supplies a house full of families required. She wore nice clothes, had gotten her hair done, and carried herself with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth. "Pam." David stared at her as if she were a ghost. "You look different." "I feel different." She continued loading groceries, unhurried. "That's a nice car. Business must be good." "It is." David shifted uncomfortably. "Listen, I've been meaning to call you. Eleanor and I were talking, and we realized we might have been a little hard on you during the whole will thing. Family should stick together, you know." Pam looked at her brother, really looked at him, and saw what she'd been too hurt to see before. David wasn't evil, just weak. He'd let fear and greed override his better instincts, and now he was living with the consequences. His marriage was strained, his kids barely knew him, and the boat he'd bought with his inheritance money sat unused in a marina because he was too busy working to enjoy it. "How's Jennifer?" Pam asked, genuinely curious. "Fine. Good. She's redecorating the kitchen with her portion of the settlement money." David hesitated. "How are the boys?" "Thriving. Michael made honor roll, and William's playing in a youth soccer league." "That's great. Really great." Another pause. "I heard you bought a house." "I did." "Must have been expensive. I hope you didn't overextend yourself." Pam almost laughed. If only he knew. "I'm managing fine, David." "Good. That's good." He looked like he wanted to say more, maybe even apologize, but the words wouldn't come. "Well, I should let you go. Maybe we could have dinner sometime. You and the boys, me and Jennifer and the kids." "Maybe," Pam said, but they both knew it would never happen. Too much had been broken, too many cruel words spoken. They were strangers now, connected only by DNA and shared history. As she drove away, Pam caught sight of David in her rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot, looking smaller somehow. She felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but mostly she felt grateful. Grateful that Robert's test had revealed who she really was, grateful that she'd learned to measure wealth in love rather than dollars, grateful that losing everything had taught her what truly mattered. That evening, as Pam sat at her large kitchen table, helping 3 different children with homework, while Rosa prepared dinner and Carmen folded laundry, her phone rang. Elena's number. "Pam? I just ran into David. He said he saw you today." "He did." "He said you looked good, successful." "I am successful." "That's wonderful. Really wonderful." Eleanor's voice had the same false brightness David's had carried. "I was thinking we should get together soon." "It's been too long since we've talked." "Has it?" Pam watched Michael patiently explaining fractions to Jennifer's twin boys and William colouring with Carmen's youngest granddaughter. "I've been pretty busy." Of course. But family is important, you know. We should stick together." There it was. The same words David had used, the same transparent attempt to rebuild bridges they'd burned themselves. Pam wondered what had prompted this sudden interest in reconciliation. Maybe their own lives weren't turning out as perfectly as they'd expected. Maybe money without love felt emptier than they'd anticipated. "Elena, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about Dad?" "Not the inheritance or the will contest, but just Dad. Do you remember what he smelled like, or the way he hummed while he shaved, or how he used to point out constellations through the kitchen window?" There was a long silence. Sometimes, I guess. I think about him every day. I see him in Michael's determination and William's kindness. I hear his voice when I'm making decisions about the house or the families who live here. I feel him in every choice I make to put love before money." "Pam, I don't understand." "I know you don't. And that's okay. That's the difference between us, Elena. You and David fought for Dad's money, but I got his legacy. And his legacy is worth so much more than you'll ever understand." After she hung up, Pam sat in her kitchen surrounded by the beautiful chaos of chosen family. Women who'd found strength in each other, children who were learning that home could be wherever love was freely given, the sound of laughter and homework, and dinner preparations that meant safety and stability and hope. Robert had been right about everything. Love was the only inheritance that really mattered. And Pam Johnson was the richest woman in the world. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Pam sat in Robert's old chair, the one piece of furniture she'd managed to save before the house was sold, and read his letter one more time. Tomorrow she would start the paperwork to establish a foundation, ensuring that this work would continue long after she was gone. She would call it the Carmen and Robert Johnson Foundation, honouring the couple who'd taught her that true wealth was measured in kindness shared and burdens lifted. She thought about David and Elena, probably lying awake in their expensive houses, wondering how Pam had managed to rise from the ashes of their betrayal. She thought about the families sleeping peacefully upstairs, safe in the knowledge that someone believed in their ability to build better lives. And she thought about Robert, her father who'd driven city buses and saved every penny and loved his children enough to test their hearts. He'd given her the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that she was worthy of love, capable of sacrifice, and strong enough to transform pain into purpose. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered into the quiet house. "Thank you for teaching me that love always wins, even when it takes a while to collect the prize." Outside, the Chicago night was cold and dark, but inside 1247 West 18th Street, the address Pam had chosen deliberately, 3 houses down from where Robert and Carmen had raised their children, warmth and light spilled from every window. It was a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had seen too much struggle, a promise that sometimes love really did triumph over greed. Pam Johnson had lost a house and gained a home. She'd lost siblings and gained a family. She'd lost everything that didn't matter and found everything that did. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all.